Let me just start out by stating something which should be obvious if you follow this teaching and others like it in the New Testament. And that is that Jesus' words about the end time, the words of the revelation of Jesus Christ to John, Paul's words about the second coming, have all been challenging for the church, problematic at times. And on various occasions, we've gotten it wrong. For example, the early church believed that Jesus was going to come again in their lifetime. When he said it will happen in this generation, they took that literally. And when it didn't happen in the first generation, the second generation thought, well, surely this is the time when Jesus is going to come. And if you read Paul's writings, that's what he believes. In fact, it was such a problem with the church in Thessalonica had trouble with people who had given up working, just thinking, well, Jesus is coming again, and what's the point? Paul had to admonish them, no, you keep on with life. But it became very clear that this was not going to happen in the first 2 or 3 generations. In fact, 2,000 years later, it still hasn't happened. There have been times when various people have stood up and said, well, surely it's going to happen quickly, this week, next week, in our lifetime. Because look at all the signs that are around. Earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, all the things that are spoken of in the New Testament. Only to find that it doesn't happen. In your lifetime, many of you have heard someone prophesy that this is going to happen based upon current events. In the 1800s, there was a man named John Darby who came up with a theory called dispensationalism. And he believed that the people of Israel and the history of Israel was one dispensation. That changed when Jesus was born. And then there was another dispensation. And then now there's a third dispensation after the end of the world. There were others that took Darby's theory and extrapolated it so that instead of 3 dispensations, there were 5 or even 7. There was a Bible that was edited to try and support Darby's theory, the Schofield Bible, still in print today. Then there were others who said, well, looking at this whole picture, clearly Christians will be taken up into heaven. There will be a rapture, kind of like a divine vacuum in which Christians are in. There have been books in our generation that have been written about that, and arguments about whether you are a pre-tribulation rapture person or a post-tribulation rapture person. The problem is that every time we try and kind of microanalyze these words and transform them from a montage and a collage, a dream sequence of thought, we end up with some kind of timeline that invariably is wrong, leads us down a primrose path to nowhere. So then, what do we do with scriptures like Jesus' teaching in the Gospel? I don't think the answer is simply disregard them or discard them in some way, but rather to step back and look at the bigger picture. Because they do tell us something important. And we can base that not upon theory or conjecture, that kind of thing, but upon what we know. For example, we know that God is a God of creation, and that the world, ordered as it is not an accidental thing. And that the world is not static, it's dynamic. The universe is dynamic. Things are always changing. We are changing. The environment in which we live is changing. The universe is slowly changing. So that it's conceivable that at some time, this fragile environment in which we live, which is able to sustain our life, may in fact fail us. And we can see that in things like global climate change. We already know that changes are happening, they're happening more rapidly, and we expected next week there's going to be a worldwide environmental conference to discuss that again. We see climate change in places like Texas, California, Alaska. We know that as human beings, we have the capability of making at least parts of the earth, if not the entire earth, uninhabitable through nuclear power, through accidents and through nuclear weapons. We can destroy this fragile environment. Maybe not all of it, but a really good part of it if we want to. So having said that, it is certainly understandable that there will come a time when the earth is no longer in its delicate ecological balance and able to support human life. There will probably be an end to the world as we know it. Now, I will be long gone before that happens, I believe. But just knowing that, knowing that things are not static, that they are dynamic, changes my perspective on the world and my sense of responsibility within that world. We also know that God is not a God of death and destruction. That in fact, He's a God of life, creation, and resurrection. That out of death, God brings resurrection. And in fact, that's often the process of growth. Something dies and something else is born. A growing church is a dying church. Certain things die away as other things grow. That's often the process. I had to outgrow my clothes as a child in order to be clothed again with new clothes. So not only is the earth and the universe dynamic and not static, but God is involved in that. Not in the death and the destruction, but in the life and resurrection. And then, as our lesson from Jeremiah points out, even when the people of God were in their worst place, in captivity, in a foreign land, unable to practice their religion, because the temple had been destroyed and the sacrifices could not be made, and they had to invent new ways of passing on the story and preserving their spiritual life through the synagogue. God was still with them. Even when they abandoned Him, when they left to make other things and were not faithful, God was still with them. And bringing them out of that bondage and captivity into a new life. Eventually the temple was rebuilt, they are restored to their homeland. Those three things, a dynamic reality, God who brings life out of death, resurrection, and the God that is always with us, changes our perspective on this morning's gospel. Whatever happens, good, bad, or indifferent, God will be with us. And we know that because we've experienced it. At some point in your life, when you felt alone, or you were afraid, or you were facing some kind of crisis, the dissolution of a marriage, the loss of a job, a health problem, you were not alone. God was there with you. Sometimes experiencing it with you, always giving that strength, comfort, and peace, the peace that passes understanding. So when we look at this morning's gospel, rather than doom and gloom and destruction, we need to look at the larger picture, because that's not the end of the story. That leads to something else. It leads to the restoration of the kingdom of God. All things ultimately return to God. There's a wonderful prayer in each of the ordination services, bishop, priest, deacon. I just discovered this morning, by the way, the ordination of a bishop is right after the funeral service. Interesting sequence of events. I'm not going to comment on that, but I do want to leave you with this prayer, because I wish that this were the collect for the day. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, let the whole world see and know that things which were cast down are being raised up, and things which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to their perfection by him, through whom all things were made. All things are being brought to their perfection. We look forward to a kingdom that is unburdened by the difficulties of this life. I look forward to being in that kingdom unshackled by this body, for which I'm growing less and less fond along the way. I've come to the conclusion it wouldn't be heaven if I'd have to drag this with me. But to know that God is always working, always moving. And we look not to the past but to the future for what God will do. In anxious, and sometimes not anxious, expectation. It's what Lent is about. Waiting and watching. Looking and hoping. It's like when I was a kid and my relatives would come to visit, I would stare out the window and look down the street